Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One position on mortality that the ancient school set out that is often criticized by many people afterwards is that suicide is acceptable, at least in certain circumstances. It's not a blanket endorsement, let alone advocacy, but death is placed into a certain perspective. And so in letter number 70, Seneca is writing to Lucilius and essentially setting out his thoughts on the matter. And he says, this is a little bit into the letter, life is not always something to hang on to. It's not as if life itself is automatically a good or a value for the Stoics. And why would that possibly be the case? Well, he tells us that our good is not just in living by itself, but in living well, bene vivere, not just vivere. So not something to cling to, not something to try to retain no matter what. So that means that we need to exercise wisdom or prudence in thinking about the circumstances in which a person, or ourselves indeed, might say, yes, this would be the right course to take to allow oneself to die or even to take active measures. And so he talks about the wise person, the sapiens, the person sometimes called the sage, who is a model for the Stoics. And he says, the wise person lives as long as he ought to, not as long as he can. So there might be some circumstances under which it makes sense for the wise person to say, I've had enough of this. He considers where he will be living, how, with whom, and what he will be doing. And then this is sort of a great sum up. He is always thinking about the quality of his life, not the quantity. The quality of life is what really matters. And then he says, if he encounters many hardships that banish tranquility, he releases himself, nor does he do so only in the extremity of need, but as soon as he begins to have doubts about his fortunes, he makes a careful assessment to determine whether it is time to quit. Now, we might pause on that and say, well, wait a second, Seneca. The Stoic wise person is this exalted figure who can be happy even while being tortured, doesn't have any sort of desires or commitments to things that don't really matter. Why would they be bothered? And so, you could say, well, maybe he doesn't mean that superlative capital W wise person. Maybe he means a person who has some measure of the virtue of wisdom or prudence, but isn't completely there and knows that they're going to run into difficulties or problems sooner or later that are going to, as he says, upset their tranquility. Now here, going on a little bit further, it's a matter of indifference to this wise person whether he brings things to an end himself or only accepts the end that comes, whether it happens sooner or later. He doesn't fear the end as if it were some terrible loss, so he's got courage as well. No one can lose much when it's only a driblet. And so this is going to lead us to another thing that is being stressed here. It's a question of dying well, sort of like living well, or dying, now notice the other qualifier, badly. You can just, I suppose, just die, but you get the idea that for Seneca, it's kind of one or the other. You're going to die badly or you're going to die well. And he says that dying well is actually escaping the risk of living badly, right? So he says, we don't want to just have hope for hope's sake. He talks about this guy who'd been thrown into a cage and was being fed like a wild animal. When someone urged him to stop eating, that is to, kill himself, he said, while life endures, all hopes remain. And Seneca says, well, okay, maybe that's true, but that's not a great line of reasoning. Life is not worth buying at every price, like demeaning yourself to the level of being treated as an animal. And then he's going to consider a number of different possible stances that we could take. And some of these may seem, a bit contradictory to each other. So the first thing that he talks about is, he says, there are times when even if certain death awaits and the sentence has been predetermined, the wise person won't lend a hand in his own execution, only if it's in his own interests will he do so. So here's an example of this. Socrates in his prison cell, he's been sentenced to execution. He will, in fact, kill himself in accordance with the laws of the city, drinking a poisonous beverage, hemlock, which will kill him. But he could have starved himself beforehand. He could have found other ways to do himself in. And instead he says, well, I'll just wait until my actual end. He says, it's foolish, here's the lesson, it's foolish to die merely through fear of death. So if your goal is to escape dying, later on in a determined way, just because you're afraid of it, maybe that's a bad reason to kill yourself. Now, we could take this back a little bit because a bit later, Seneca is going to say, if you have to choose between a death through torture and, a death that you impose upon yourself, it's kind of reasonable to kill yourself rather than to have to go through torture. And some of the other examples that he gives where somebody is in a gladiatorial contest or they're being taken somewhere as a slave and they choose to kill themselves, they're saying, well, rather than living badly, I am going to allow myself to be killed or find a way to kill myself. So, that's one possible stance that you could take. You could say, I'm not going to, do myself in. And he's got this example of Scribonia, the aunt of Drusus Libo, a young man who was as stupid as he was well born, very ambitious, more so than anyone could be in that period, and more than he should have been in any period. So he's a guy who's vicious, right? Vice of overambition. He was sick and had been carried from the Senate in his litter. All of his relatives had deserted him. He began to take counsel whether he should commit suicide or whether he should wait. And Scribonia said to him, why does it please you to do another's business? You're going to die quick enough. Why kill yourself ahead of time? He does, in fact, kill himself. And he says, when one is bound to die in 3 or 4 days at an enemy's behest, remaining alive is doing another's business. So that's one way you could look at it. And, then he talks about the death by torture. And he says, why not put out your hand and take the non-torture death? He says, if I were getting ready to sail, I'd pick out a ship. If I were getting ready to move in somewhere, I'd pick out a house. Just so, if I were going to die, I would choose my manner of my death. And he says, in the same way, long duration does not itself make life better. Long duration does make death worse. And in death, more than in other things, we ought to make, he says, allowances for temperament. Now, the word that's being translated there as temperament could also be translated as character. It's mores, which is a plural, and this literally means our customs or habits, the things that make us the kind of people who we are. So it's not just temperament and like, well, some people feel this way and some people feel this way. Some people are naturally happy. Some people are naturally angry. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the habits that we've built up within ourselves. He also talks about following inclination, impetum, right? The phrase there is actually, let a person make his exit according to his own inclination. Whether he prefers the sword or the noose or some poison, let him go forward with it and break the bonds of servitude. And then he says something else that's really quite extraordinary. So when you live, your life should be something that you actually can take satisfaction in, should be pleasing to you. And it should also be pleasing to other people. If other people are looking at you and like, well, that guy's a scumbag, I don't like having him around, that's a sign there's probably something wrong with the way that you're living. Death is not like that. He says the only person you have to please in your death is you. Now, we could perhaps think of some exceptions to this, but it's actually a pretty good idea. He says the best death is the one that person prefers. It's foolish to think now notice, what will people say? One person will say I did not act courageously enough. Another will say I was too rash, so they're in a controversy about, was courage actually shown or not? A third will say another kind of death was braver. Let's pause on this for a second. You can't please everybody, and if you're trying to please people through the way that you die, that's kind of a bad way to end things, because you're not going to be around when they're complaining about you or praising you or anything like that. This is your last thing, so make it your own, Seneca would say in these sorts of cases. And he says, reputation has no bearing on the decision you now have in hand. The only goal is to escape fortune's grasp as quickly as you can. And what is escape fortune's grasp? This wild world that we live in where things are unpredictable and there's no, cause and effect, rewarding virtue and punishing vice in consistent ways. You do have control over what's within your domain, your power, what's up to you. The other things you don't control. You don't control how people are going to view your death. You don't control what they're going to make of it, even if they'll know about it at all. And he does consider an objection, which you could say comes up in Plato's Phaedo to a certain extent. It's wrong to kill yourself. You shouldn't do that. He says you'll find some people, even some committed philosophers, who say that one should never take violent measures against one's own life. Why? Because then you become your own murderer. You should wait for the end that nature has decreed. And Seneca says they're blocking the road to freedom. They are actually getting in the way of what nature has decreed. Of all the things that eternal law has done for us, this is the best. We have one way into life, birth, and many ways out. Am I to wait for the cruel action of disease or of a person when I could pass through the midst of my torments, shake off my adversities, and depart? And he says, we can't complain about life because it doesn't hold anyone by force. If you want to kill yourself, you can. The human condition is, he says, well situated in that nobody is miserable except by his own fault. If it suits you, live. If not, you're allowed to return to where you came from, non-being. Your body can break down into its elements and then become other things. That's, allowable for you. So it's not that nature is going to get ticked off at you if you kill yourself. Nature is just going to chew you up and put you back into the hopper and make other natural things out of you, right? So here then he talks about our priorities, and he says, you've endured bloodletting to relieve a headache. Sometimes people sever a vein as a way of losing weight. There's no need of a great wound that splits open the chest. A lancet opens the way to that great freedom. A nick buys your tranquility. If you want to die, it's totally up to you, and it's easy enough for you to make that happen. It's merely a question of what your priorities are. What do you value? What do you care about? What do you place higher, and what do you place lower? So he says, listen, if you're desiring things without end, you're going to really desire life because that's the only way you can experience it. So what do we need to do? He says we need to prepare ourselves for death. And he uses terms like rehearsal or practice. And this is what the Stoics actually did do. Seneca refers to these Stoic practices, sometimes called premeditatio malorum, thinking about bad things in advance. Death is one of those things. Sometimes people like to talk about memento mori. They love the Latin phrase. Seneca nowhere uses memento mori. That's a later phrase that comes in, but it's the same idea. Be conscious of the fact that you're going to die. I mean, you can think about other things as well that can be scary, that can be oppressive. He says, with other things, we may perhaps to have practiced them in vain. We can prepare our mind against poverty. Seneca's a great example of this. He's rich his entire life. He does voluntary, days of poverty, living like a poor person. But, it never actually winds up being what he has to do because he dies at the order of Nero. We can steel ourselves to disregard pain and be lucky enough to have sound and healthy bodies that never demanded any proof of our courage. A little less likely if we live long enough. We have taught ourselves to be brave in facing the loss of those who we love. And if we're lucky, our loved ones stay alive. But we're going to die. There is no escaping death. So if you're going to prepare for these other things, why in the hell aren't you preparing for the one thing that you can be guaranteed you are going to run into, although probably not experience all the way to the end? And so he also talks about another major consideration. So the Stoics, as well as other ancient philosophers, liked using the examples of people who did this well. And Seneca is going to talk about two kinds of people. The great men, for example, Cato, he's already brought up Socrates, he brings up the Scipios and people like that. These are people whose deeds we habitually admire and they've been elevated beyond imitation, right? And Seneca says, that's good. That's actually not that helpful. Let's think about more ordinary people who, as it turns out, aren't that ordinary because they rise to the occasion. They end up displaying bravery or courage. Fortitudo, they are fortis in Latin. Who are examples like this? Well, he talks about a rather disgusting act and apologizes a little bit for it. There is a German who goes off to the toilets during the preparations for the morning show, and he takes, back then they didn't have toilet paper, so they would take a sponge that was attached to a stick, and that's what you'd clean yourself with, and everybody else would clean themselves with. He takes it, shoves it down his throat, and asphyxiates himself or chokes himself to death, right? That's pretty gross, but it's successful. He kills himself. And what does Seneca say about this? What a brave man. He was worthy to be granted a choice in his fate. How boldly would he have used a sword? How courageously would he have thrown himself over a jagged cliff or into the depths of the sea with no resources from anywhere? He still found a way to provide his own death, his own weapon. Any one of us could do that. Any one of us can find myriad ways to die, to kill ourselves, right? He gives a few other examples of a man who's being dragged off to slavery. And here we go. A man consigned to the morning spectacle was being conveyed there in a wagon surrounded by guards. He let his head sink lower till he could get it between the spokes of the wheel, and then he allows the wagon to break his neck. Another ingenious way of using what's available in the environment. He talks about a barbarian who's given a lance, a spear, to fight in a naval battle, and he's like, why the hell am I going to kill these guys for those people up there? I'll just kill myself. And Seneca is not saying we all have to be quite so dramatic in this, but if you want to die, as he's going to say, nature keeps us in a prison without walls. We're in a prison, but we can go anywhere we want. We can pick up anything that we would like to. So he says, if desperate characters and criminals have such a spirit, won't people who've been prepared against misfortune, preparing ourselves for death, by long practice and by reason, the ruler of all things, reason teaches us there are many ways of getting to our fate, but the end is the same. What is the end? The harbor that we're going to slip into eventually at the end of our voyage, death. And so he says, since it's coming, it doesn't matter when it begins. The same reasoning advises you to die in the way you prefer if you have the opportunity. But if not, to do so in whatever way you can, grasping any available means of doing violence to yourself. It's wrong to steal the means, notice where he ends, of living, this contrast, but very fine to steal the means of dying. And so he says we need to learn how to die, and we need to learn how to die well. And this is an integral part of living well. Dying well and living well go together. They're not absolutely opposed to each other, as many people think. And this is really the orthodox Stoic position that Seneca is conveying here to his interlocutor and to us, his readers.